water and we stir it up and it's pretty good, like a fondue, you know. But one time, Betty needed a couple of buckets. It's another friend of ours. So he had come in late and Betty was sitting there with 2 buckets that Mr. Lee gave her. Oh, he was all worked up while she was taking these buckets. And she never took them. And he'd take them for years. But that's a story about Don. But we really loved him. I mean, and we miss him terribly. Wonderful man. Thank you.
Thank you. No? Okay. I met Donald when he moved in next door on Bel Estes Drive. The way I got introduced to him, one morning, it was during the winter time, it was still dark outside, and I heard this strange sound over my fence. I said, what in the heck, is there a possum or a raccoon? I looked over the fence. It was Don. He had a flathead shovel, and he was shoveling his backyard by hand. And his backyard was as big as this yard, and the weeds were this high. I said, Don, you're never going to finish that. Every day I'll be here, and it'll get done. And he did it. It took him a long time, but he did a beautiful job. I learned a lot about persistence from Don. And then I also learned about his fetish for old cars. One day we were having lunch, and incidentally, we had probably, in the last 15 years, 300 or 400 lunches together. An hour or 2 at a time. So I learned all about the family, all about what he did, but he's nuts about cars. And one day he said he saw a car online that was up in Canada. So he got a big flatbed and he drove it all the way to Canada, and he looked at that car and he didn't like it. So he turned around and he came home. And on the way home, coming to Oregon, he had this big white Suburban, which he thought was the greatest thing in the world. It was a powerful car and he loved it. It sat up high. And he hit a turkey right on the front of the car. And we were having lunch. I said, geez, if that would have hit your windshield, would have... And he said, oh, it didn't. I said, what did you do to the car? He said, well, it made a little dent in the front. So after lunch, I said, let's go look at your car. So I went out there, and so help me, there were still turkey feathers on that. So, aren't you ever going to wash this thing? But that was gone.
Yeah, I met Don years ago. It's probably 15 years ago at the donut shop, and I was working in Milpitas at a friend's company, and so I'd go in there, and I knew Doc here and some other people, but I'd get a donut, cup of coffee, and I'd leave. Well, then I started talking to Don one day because he's got his book where he designed, and he had the most immaculate printing and numbers, and he would draw gates. Whatever he was designing was just phenomenal. And so I said, what are you doing? He goes, well, I'm designing whatever it was he was designing. And I said, well, I got a project, and I told him I do signs and stuff. So anyway, I had him, he's welded frames and stuff out of steel for me and all that. And I said, just quote it, not a friend thing. I said, quote this like you're doing a business, you know. And anyway, so we got to talk more and more, and then he was always there at like 5:30 in the morning is the problem. And I says, I'm not even out of bed then, you know. So anyway, over the years, I would stop by Roundtree, you know, and then we'd go to lunch or whatever. And he was always had something interesting to say. But when you're talking about going to Canada, I remember him telling me, he says he had cancer treatment, and so he came back through the border, and all of a sudden the speaker comes out, get out of your car, and guys run out with M16s and all this, you know, and they start surrounding him, and he's thinking, I didn't do anything. And he'd set off the atomic detectors. These things were so sensitive, they knew that he'd had a...
was that treadmill?
It was a test.
Yeah.
Yeah, but to think how little that is, and he's in his vehicle. And then he had to explain, and I think he had paperwork, or they checked it out, and everything was cool. But he said it was something else. So. But I had, as if he didn't have enough to store. When I moved, it's was about 4 years ago. I stored my Mini Cooper project. It's a little British sports car from the '60s, and he goes, "Oh, you can store it at my place." And I go, "You have room?" He says, "Yeah, we'll find a place." And I said, "Well, I know it's free, but I says I don't want it in the rain outside. I don't have a way to keep it. It's a bare chassis, you know, it's just a bare body." So he goes, "Well, it's not very big, and it's literally like 4.5 feet by about 7.5 feet." And so he goes, "We'll put it in the garage in front." So I wheeled it over there, and he had it for about 2 years. And so I'd finally gotten my life squared away, and I had a trailer to move it and all that by then. And so one day he calls and he says, "I think it's time you pick up your car." I said, "I understand." I said, "I got a trailer now and all that." So, but we were always swapping stuff, and he was borrowing tools from me. There's a joke at this roto hammer. The guys know about it at the donut shop. I had a roto hammer for drilling holes in concrete. And he was always doing something where he had to drill holes in concrete and put anchor bolts or whatever. And so I'd call him up. "Hey, Don, I have some work to do. Can I come over and get my drill?" "Oh, yeah, no problem. You're going to bring it back, though, right?" "It's my drill." So I said, "No problem." I said, "But I have to, sometimes I get a last-minute thing. I have to go do some work, and I don't know if I'm going to be there." But he always had a good chuckle, and I'd leave NASA at times, and I'd say, "Hey, it's about lunchtime." He goes, "Come on by." He goes, "I'll buy you a hamburger." He liked going to Red Robin. It's over here. And anyway, he would always have some little thing or chuckle, and I just think he'd kind of clear his throat. "Well, you know," and he'd lead off like that and just tell some little story. That's how I found out so much about his brother Al and the family, and you know, him growing up on the farm and talking about hot rodding it up there in Canada. And he was a real kick. I always told people, I'm going to be 66, and I'd say, when I get old, I want to be like him. Because he always had this enthusiasm, and every time I went over there, there was always something like him cutting 6,000 bricks. And he pieced this whole thing, and the backyard was a perfect thing, and he'd get damaged bricks, and they looked like he bought these things new. He made a tool to bevel the edges and cut them down to size and all that. And every couple of weeks or so, I'd go over there, and it was something different, and he'd accomplish, you know, the chimney. He goes, "Just notice I took the chimney out, 2-story chimney." I'm thinking, you know, one guy is taking this out at his age, and he's knocking this whole chimney down and replacing termite damage. And it's just like, I said, I hope I'm like that when I get older, because it's just amazing. He goes, "Well, you know, I work for 4 hours," and he goes, "Then I take a nap for about an hour and eat some lunch." And then he goes out and hits it again until dinner time. And I guess Karen would say, "Are you coming home? Or when are you going to be home?" But he was just a real kick, and I learned a lot from him.
And there's some bricks here.
Yeah, bricks.
Yep.
Hi, my name is Terry. This is my wife, Vita, and we're fortunate enough to have lived next to Don and Karen when we moved into our home on Round Tree Drive. In fact, Don and Karen were still living there. They hadn't moved to this home. And like for you, Don was kind of my idol too, because he always did something. He always had something new to do. He always had cutting bricks and whatnot. But there was one day in particular, I was at work, and our son Danny called when I was at work, and he said, Terry, we were playing basketball, we hit the line, and there's water just flowing all over the place. I says, "Go call Don." He ran over to Don's place, and Don came over and he shut the water off, and before I got home that day, he had the water reconnected, and we had water into the house, and everything was okay. And, you know, I'll never forget how he helped us out in that one. So I thought, well, I know Don always stopped for donuts at Lee's place. And I stopped once in a while too to pick up donuts for the shop, so I knew where he sat, and I knew he liked one donut and a coffee in the morning. So the next day I stopped at Lee's and I said, "Lee, here's a couple of dollars. This is for Don's donut and Don's coffee, but don't you tell Don where that came from." And we did this 2 or 3 times, right? But it didn't take him very long to get that out of it. You weren't very good at it. Were you? No. So So we kind of paid him back, but you can never pay back, a guy back for the help that you need when it's an emergency. We'll miss him, and thank you for having us over, Karen. We done?
Well, I've been telling a few people that Don and Karen were my neighbors, but they, couldn't figure that out. And they were my neighbors, but they never moved into the house. But it was pretty much, I saw Don every day for years and years and years. Because I lived across the street from the house that they had on Sutter Avenue. And I'm just amazed listening to you guys because obviously you got a word in edgewise. And I got a word in edgewise. Such a great talker and great storyteller. And I guess he just wasn't interested in my kind of story. But what he was interested in is when he had too much stress. Wanted my barrel. Use my trash barrel. But John was really, even though he didn't live there, he was pretty much the mayor of the neighborhood. And if you wanted anything done or something wasn't quite right, you just hold on. And his sharp evil eye would take care of him. So we missed him a lot on Sutter Avenue.
Jim's got it.
I'm Sandy Graham, and I moved to the neighborhood where Don and Karen lived on Moreau when 44 years ago. And my youngest was just a year old, and their kids were young, and little Susan here was about that tall with her curls, come down and help me when I gardened, and our kids kind of grew up together when they were young, but then we moved away, but we've stayed in touch and stayed friends all those years and kept visiting back and forth. And I was fortunate enough to come and visit Don and Karen last fall, I believe it was, late summer, fall.
Yeah, you both.
And Roy's granddaughter was in a recital in San Jose, and we came over afterwards and fixed dinner for us, and that was the last time we got to see Don. I was certainly so lucky happy that we were able to do that. But I felt fortunate to be friends with Don and Karen for all these years. I've always enjoyed them.
Jim?
I'm next. I'm Jim Packer. We live in the neighborhood of Pinemont Drive. My wife Lynette, my son Mark, who used to terrorize the neighborhood before. Anyway,
He needs no introduction.
I used to go and visit Don occasionally when he'd be down at the house working. We talked about being on the farm. I grew up kind of till I was 10 or 11 years old in eastern South Dakota, and of course he was up in Canada, and the weather was quite similar. We had fun talking about operating tractors and different things around the farm, and then of course he stayed there longer into his teenage years, and we moved away and came out here. And so he had a lot more stories to tell about the cars and different things they did when they were kids. So it was interesting, and he was just such a mechanic. Just do anything. So anyhow, I gotta say just one more little story about his sense of humor. We needed a couple holes, keyholes cut in a thing to put on the wall to hang pictures up, or set pictures on. And I just went down to ask him, do you know anybody where I could take this and get this done? I didn't want to make a mess out of it. And he looked it over and he says, you got anything to do today? And I said, yeah. He said, go ahead and go do it. I said, well, he He said, oh, just think, he said, come back and see me in a couple hours or this evening or whatever. So I go back and I says, did you find somebody? He says, yeah, oh yeah. He says, go look in the motorhome there. So here's